today's going to be a real fun discussion. I'm joined by Richard Hanania. He's the director of the Center for Study of Partisanship and Ideology, CSPI. And he's someone who has been really engaging a lot of different issues, foreign policy, culture issues, foreign affairs. So thanks for joining me, Richard.
Thanks for having me, David.
So tell us a little bit about your background and then how you came to create this center so we know the context of your work.
So I was a background in academia. I have a law degree. I got my degree in, I got a PhD in political science. So I wanted to be an academic. I had a research fellowship at Columbia University. I studied political science with a focus on international relations. So I was at Columbia until 2020. At some point, I realized that, I could do more interesting work outside of the academy. I didn't like the political climate, but I also didn't like sort of the narrowness and the sort of irrelevance of the work. And so I decided I would do something else. I started my own think tank. It's called the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. We have our own. We have a website, CSPIcenter.com, and you can be put on our mailing list. We have a lot of great scholars, and I just I wanted to bring people who are could do good empirical work, academics, or people who were thinking about academia and thinking about maybe doing something else, just getting their work out, just giving them the resources to produce work and then getting it out there. And so I've been doing that since 2020. I also write my own things. So I have my own Substack. I have my own Twitter. I do op-eds. I've written a book. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it.
So you weren't in danger of being canceled, were you? Most of these folks that I meet, I meet a lot of folks who were in academia that end up creating their own institutions online, and usually they get pushed out of academia. It looks like you left on your own accord. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I knew that it wasn't going to work. I mean, I would have had to go through life pretending to be someone else. I would have had to, just sort of not even like the people that I was, around. So, I mean, I was, I pre-canceled, I guess.
What's the fundamental problem you have with the environment of Columbia?
It's every it's not Columbia in particular. I mean, I've been to other universities too. I mean, I think that academia tends to be very narrow its focus. So you focus on international relations, or you focus on political science. You'll focus on some very, very narrow topic, and also they also often use very bad methods. A lot of they use statistics for international relations that I don't think make sense. I don't think the underlying data is very good. I don't think the theories are very well developed. And so, I don't like, I like to write things that have broad application and, are important. People would want to read it, not because they're specialists in the field or because of a career, but because it tells you something important about the world. There's also the political climate. I mean, it's bad. It's worse than anyone really thinks. They've had a discussion. I have my own CSPI podcast with Richard Lowry recently. He's at the University of Texas, and we talk about this. I mean, it's basically become openly political. You have to pledge allegiance to diversity, equity, inclusion when you apply for a job. Now, in a lot of places, you have to, put out a statement, why you support diversity. It's basically affirmative action. And then you are supposed to, and then they hire you based on affirmative action and these other criteria. They publish things. They tell you cite more women in your papers. They just do this, explicitly. And then sort of the way you're promoted is also based on these same criteria. So it used to be just, politically biased, and you didn't have maybe trouble if you were moderate conservative. Now it's like they don't even pretend to be, objective or, care about truth or scholarship. They have these, ideas about, achieving equal outcomes between groups, and nothing else matters. And it's, the reason why I took over academia, I think, is because they don't have objective standards to judge what's true or not. They're very insular. So, when you have a bad academic department versus a good academic department, I mean, nobody really suffers from that. I mean, as long as your status is based on having, just based on reputation, and then based on the right demographic mix of your faculty, then that's all that matters. There's really not much interest there in truth.
So, are you consider yourself a conservative or whatever? Or what do you?
I mean, yeah, I must. I think after the COVID stuff, I think I was, maybe a little bit more, open-minded to, I liked some things about conservatives, and I liked a few things about liberals. But after the COVID stuff, and after they were still doing lockdowns in Europe in the winter this year, and then they still having mask mandates and mask mandates for children. I just, yeah, I don't, I identify with conservatives now. I just think that that's just such a infringement on liberty. I mean, there's other things that are bad enough about liberals, but this to me was sort of, went beyond what they were doing before.
It's interesting, because a lot of the Republican primary races right now for the midterms, they really haven't tapped into that issue. I mean, the most that you'll hear from some of the edgy ones, they'll say, we need to investigate or fire Fauci, or, that's about all you get from the best firebrand conservatives. But there's nobody touching that. And I think there's a few reasons why. One is Trump went really hard for, I had to do the warp speed product. It was because that's the one thing that the media gives him credit for. And he's desperate to have something that the official, boomer era institutions of media will say was like on the right side of history. And they very, very much love that product that he was pushing. And so he'll take credit for that. So he can have something that the TV will say he did right. But I think that chills off a lot of the people who would be the conservatives in those races, because they want his endorsement. They want his energy. And you can't really badmouth that product. And then the other thing is he was okay with the lockdowns at the initial stage. And so you can't really go hard against that either on some things. So I think that's chilled out that topic in the conservative primaries. But like at my radio program, whenever I have doctors and scientists and epidemiologists that talk about this issue of the pandemic, it's the most interesting topic for my listeners in terms of, downloads and clicks.
Yeah, I think it's for a lot of conservatives, it's not really an issue anymore, because in the conservative areas, they're really not doing masking, they're not doing lockdowns, they're not, really doing anything. So these places in like Los Angeles and San Francisco, they still threaten with mask mandates. They're still masking children in some cases. But I think conservatives have, sort of gotten over it. So it's not surprising to me
that's stupid, because that was the greatest abusive thing I've ever seen any government do. I mean, you can't just let that go. I mean, it's like, but they've just moved on, like, faster than they did. 9/11 happened, and they stayed with 9/11 for years and years and years as the frame of the Republican Party.
No, I think
this happens, and it's like, okay, we just want to forget that happened. We're tired.
I think a lot of people. I mean, I think a lot of people are just never going to forget and never going to sort of forgive liberals for this. But I think one thing which it has manifested itself, I think the school choice movement is much stronger than it otherwise would have been. Now it's much easier to make the case to people. Look, the public schools are crazy. It's not just the woke stuff. It's also that they basically stopped working during the pandemic. And I see conservatives sort of going harder on the school choice issue, both because of the COVID stuff and because of the cultural issue. So that, that's a positive, and that's sort of, I think, an after effect of the coronavirus restrictions.
I saw in a interview you did that you mentioned that there's this new, the nationalist or whatever conservative movement. They tend to scapegoat the libertarian conservatives for issues. And you said, when have they really had power in the Republican Party? Do you tend to pick a side in that debate, or you're in your own thing and you're just trying to look at it objectively?
I mean, I'm trying to look at it objectively. I mean, when did Bush or, when did Reagan, I mean, did the government shrink during these presidencies? It did not. I mean, did this, I think a lot of the wokeness comes from the civil rights laws. I mean, did the civil rights laws, were they scaled back? No, in so many cases they expanded. You look at like foreign policy. I mean, the president was George W. Bush. It wasn't Ron Paul or anything. So I don't know how you blame libertarians for what's gone wrong. It seems like the conservatives have been in charge for the last several decades.
Why do you think they do that? Why do they scapegoat the libertarians for the sins of the neocons and rhinos? I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense. It seems like you make an alliance with them, because they're because you've got the paleocons and nationalists and populists. You got libertarians. That seems like two disaffected groups that have always been the nerds of the conservative philosophy movement. And it's like, instead of working together, which some of them do, but there's this need to see this, the resurgent MAGA nationalist conservative movement say, hey, everything that gone wrong was your fault, little nerds. It's like, you were the problem. It's like, no, actually, it's just the neocons and the rhinos that have been running things. Neither of you really had any power,
Yeah. I think that a lot of them pay, a lot of them are sort of, I think they're, sort of the people who are scapegoating libertarians are sort of nerds who they're paying attention to intellectual libertarians. They're paying attention to the Cato Institute, or they're paying attention to like Paul Ryan, and they've convinced themselves that these people have been running the Republican Party because they're like the most prominent intellectual spokesman for anything on the conservative side. So I think it's part of that. They just don't like the rhetoric of libertarianism, so they feel like they want to do something else. But I think a lot of it's just I think it's they don't even they don't even think about the policy. It's just like Reagan talked about. Reagan was in many ways better than the other Republican administrations, but they all talk of the sort of libertarian, the sort of libertarian friendly stuff, and they and even though they don't always act on it, a lot of these people, I think they want economic redistribution, so they wish the Republican Party had gone more redistributionist. I think a lot of people are upset about immigration, and they see libertarians as more pro-immigration. So there's a lot going on here. I think people are always sort of looking for like the new thing, and I think that's like it sort of sees this like libertarianism was like an official ideology for conservatives, so people want to do something different.
Right. But it was like you said, it was never an ideology that was, I mean, Ron Paul was treated like a thought criminal by the Republican establishment. They shut him out of any of the fair, they were always changing the rules and the primaries and caucus delegates and all this shenanigan stuff. Yeah. So he had never had an open invitation to the Republican Party. They didn't want anything to do with abolish the Department of Education, abolish the Department of Agriculture. They didn't want anything to do with that.
Yeah. Well, they would say stuff like that. They would always say stuff, I think, like, cut back on Department of Education, abolish Department. I think a lot of Republicans, have actually promised that. Now, of course, they never did it. I mean, they never had the guts to do any of it. So
yeah. You're saying these people that criticize them for being libertarians are just taking the rhetoric too seriously. Because they're wonkish by nature. So they're probably tending to hang out in DC and enclaves.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And and it's so like it's like the things that they're mad about, the people who hate the libertarians, they're often mad about the cultural issues. And it's like, look, I mean, a lot of the stuff is coming straight from the Department of Education. A lot of the stuff is coming through like I've written about this, the civil rights law. I mean, a lot of the stuff is coming from government. And so,
there's this weird tension that they make that's artificial, which is like cutting government is an antithesis to correctly dealing with cultural rot and decay. And it's like you have to pick a utilitarian economic budget or cultural issues. Like, no, they go hand in hand together.
Really. I agree with you. I agree with you completely. Yeah. And I think a lot of the libertarians they see are sort of like left-leaning libertarians. So I think these people are overrepresented, but I think those people are crazy. I think if you had a libertarian society, you would have a more conservative society. So I wouldn't take those people too seriously.
Right. And then the whole idea of that's another thing that's popular among some of the new right figures is a critique on consumerism. And they again root that back into some kind of deification of the market. That's not really what a free market society would do. It'd have a lot more discipline. You wouldn't have easy credit if you didn't have a Federal Reserve and all that, making credit so artificially available to 16-year-olds in the credit card forms and so forth. This is something that's a manifestation of empire and central power that creates the foundations for decadent consumerism. So they kind of go hand in hand. And I've never understood this weird, and it's not just, it's the New York Times guys too. What's the guy that wrote the Decadence Society? I had him on my show.
Ross do that.
Yeah. I mean, he does the same thing. Oh, it's decadence is because we're too free more. And it's like, I don't see that. Federal Reserve is what empowers this decadence, really. I mean, for starters.
Yeah. I tend to think the culture and economics are, almost, you can find all kinds of different examples. You can find very decadent libertarian, not so much libertarian societies, but, free market societies with like low religion and low fertility. And you could find, socialist societies with the same, it affects the culture, but it's not like a very clear relationship between some economic philosophy and the social. I agree with you that in general, a libertarian society, creates more personal responsibility because people have to, people have to deal with the consequences of their actions. But it's not a perfect relationship. And, I think either side will make a mistake if they think that there is.
So is there a through line through the work that you do at your center and the work that you do on your Substack? It's something, a common theme that you keep, bumping into, a big idea that you're trying to push out there or scratch the surface of, or?
Yeah, I think there's probably, two or three themes. I mean, one is I think the skepticism about expertise that sort of runs through everything I do and almost everything we do at CSPI. There's a lot of critiques of academia. Um, there's a lot of stuff that Philippe Lemoine, one of our researchers, did on COVID restrictions and the data, epidemiology, and then so that's like one of the things, the critiques of expertise. The Another one is, foreign policy, which ties into critique of expertise. I think the foreign policy establishment in the United States has been wrong. And there's also, an anti-wokeness thing, which again ties into the anti-expertise, academia and these diversity administrators. And, I focus a lot on civil rights law as sort of the cause of a lot of the rot. So I think that those are probably like the three through lines between my different kinds of work.
Do you think that there's a common worldview that's made all of those areas problematic in terms of foreign policy, expertise, and the woke civil rights errors?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a general. Distrust of nonsense. I mean, I like systems that have incentives and feedback mechanisms to arrive at truth or to make progress in some way. So this will lead someone to be skeptical of social engineering, which a lot of civil rights law is. It would make somebody skeptical of anti-market forces. I'm also skeptical of again, foreign policy establishment. The American empire is sort of this kind of like a central planning on a global stage. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a respect for incentives, and there's a belief in there's a belief that there's a lot of BS out there, and you assume things are BS unless there's a good system underlying it and way to aggregate information.
Yeah, my question is there a culture? Do you see a cultural source for these various errors that are flowing from, or is this coming from? Like, I have a particular thesis. I see the state and where things are going as a religious issue, and that there's a change in religion taking place between an old civic order, an old civic religion, and a new civic religion, and how that works itself out in relationship to, the values that we're going to hold as transcendent. Do you see that as what's really causing this? Because there is this worship of experts, right? There's this worship of experts that leads us into completely ridiculous places scientifically and in medicine. It leads us into stupid, ridiculous places as it pertains to foreign policy. The experts tell us just another $1 trillion and we'll get Afghanistan looking like Vermont. The experts tell us, we've studied this. Your child is a pangender because of the way he likes to cook. So these are all things that are like kind of this expert thing, but it kind of comes at a certain time. It comes out of the progressive movement. There's some other things going on culturally. Do you look into that?
You can call it a religious impulse. I mean, people are generally trustful of authority. And so, most people listen to what they've been told most of the time. No, I don't really see it as a sort of like a religious or spiritual question. I mean, there's obviously psychological and sort of social influences going on here, but it's not, when I hear those kinds of theories, I don't know how to, I don't know how to prove them or disprove them. They sometimes sound plausible, but then, I say, oh, can I really prove this? And often I feel like I can't.
But why are things falling apart? Just the cycle of empires. We're at the 250-year mark or something.
I think that there's a lot of, bad policies we made. I think in the 1930s, I think that the democracy, has a sort of natural tendency towards this, where people don't think about the issues very hard, or they don't sort of have the capacity to think about the issues, so they just do things that sound good. I think that in the United States we're living off of we're still living in sort of FDR and Lyndon Johnson's America. I mean, it's still our government. What it does mostly is still Social Security, Medicare, the global empire that emerged in the aftermath of World War II, civil rights stuff that came in the 1960s, the Great Society. That's when the soft on crime policy started. So I think there's a lot of just inertia in the system. And there's a lot of inertia. I think that we're living off of these two really bad, these two eras where we made some really, really bad policy choices. choices. And I think that, I think that's happened. And then social media, I think, has made us dumber. I think Twitter, as a major influence, is only, 10 or 12 years old. I think the rise of wokeness is part of that. I mean, I think that, the discourse has gotten dumber too, and all this stuff could have there's a feedback loop between the technology and economics and the social stuff, but I don't know about the having some kind of religious impulse as the center of this. I don't know. I sort of look for explanations of, okay, if there is, I ask where did that come from.
Do you see the problems coming from a lack of believability in the original American myth that we've had in the last century, like at this post World War II era, that we're the rulers of the world and we're going to make the world a place for progress and democracy. I mean, that really goes with Wilson, but it really gets cemented with World War II. Do you see that as like just having enough wars that don't work out really sours the nation's charisma and self-confidence, and therefore it starts to turn in on itself in a state of madness?
Yeah, I don't know if the foreign policy factors that much in Americans' minds. I mean, I think Americans, they don't pay much attention to these wars. After 9/11, there was like 5-10 years where foreign policy was really, really important. And they told us, there's a, threat. I think now foreign policy is an elite thing, like the, Russia invasion of Ukraine, elites were obsessed with it. I don't think I think the public cares more about inflation and domestic politics. So I think that there's certainly psychological things going on at the mass
I tend
level.
to think so too, but then I saw this pickup truck with Ukrainian flag a few months ago, and I was like, "What in the world?"
Yeah.
It was a big giant flag, the same size that they would do the thin blue line flag or for police or whatever, and I was like, "What is happening here?"
I've seen that too. I mean, I still see more thin blue line, the police flag more than Ukraine. I mean, Americans care more about the policing issues around on both sides. Like I see more Black Lives Matter, and I see more police flags than I do Ukraine. Although some of it does trickle down, but this Ukraine thing is is still very new. I don't think it's a lasting thing we think about. I think that we have a system. I think that we have a system that is based in a large part on affirmative action. I think people do not know like the extent to which that this drives people crazy, not only the backlash to it of people being lied to, but people who are beyond their level of competence getting into institutions and like becoming very angry and trying to change those institutions. So I think that there's a lot here, and I think there's more. There's a social sort of sorting where people really only talk to other people like themselves, and especially like the class and the sort of the class diversions here. I think that there's a lot of liberals and a lot of people in government and journalism who never talk to anybody from the other side. So they don't care. They institute a mask mandate. 50-60% of the people hate it. They don't care. They never see those people. They only see they only care about the people that they work with or the people they see socially, or maybe the people that live in their area at most. So yeah, there's a lot going on. I just think I think the foreign policy stuff, I mean, it's been disastrous, I think, for a lot of the world. I don't, I think it's, I don't know if it, I think more, I think less, it's less that what's going on in the world, like we bring it here into our politics. I think it's more we project our politics onto foreign conflicts. Oh, Putin is just like, I saw this one ridiculous article on like The Root or one of those stupid websites where it's like, Putin is like white Southerners and Ukraine are like blacks in the South. And they were trying to, they're just taking the thing that they know and applying it to the new thing. So I think that's more common, where sort of the domestic politics and the cultural stuff is really driving it.
Well, what is it about America, though, that culturally we have become so comfortable with the normative idea of affirmative action and all of that, which you said I think you've done some work in that would be interesting to think about. Why isn't Saudi Arabia doing that affirmative action? Why isn't China doing that? Why aren't other countries doing that kind of thing?
Yeah,
what is it about us that makes us excited and allowing this type of stuff to become so expected as part of the norm?
Yeah, China was doing actually affirmative action until recently. They started scaling it back.
For who?
First, just all minorities. They would have like lower standards for entrance exams and stuff, and then they've been scaling it back just the last few years. But they did have a pretty strong preferences for minority groups.
For like people from outside of China proper, or like minorities within the China?
Minorities to non-Han Chinese.
Okay.
So like Mongols and like Uyghurs and
so they
like
did
that.
it. Okay.
Yeah. So they did it. It was different. I mean, it's different though. It's not like it's not like they would come in and say, it's Chinese supremacy to have standard. You have to hold us to different standards.
Right. That's kind of what I'm getting at. It's like, why are we?
It's a more cultural thing. Yeah. It's not just points on a test we have. We have like a deep cultural thing.
We have self-flagellation to get social status. Why is that unique to
so
America,
in the 1960s? I think that the people saw the plight of Black people in the South. It got on TV for the first time, and they would just because TV hadn't become a thing until the 1950s and 1960s, and that made and this was a recurring theme in American history. There was always Northerners who were very sad about the plight of the Blacks in the South, and so they did something about it. But when that became the center of our politics, they couldn't just stop and say, okay, we got rid of segregation. You had these sort of these race hustlers, these ethnic activists mobilized when they didn't get equality of results in every kind of profession or every standard test. They started attacking standards. And white people still flip out about the historical circumstances Blacks had found themselves in. So they always sort of went along with it and didn't think too much. Eventually, like the institutions themselves changed to like accommodate this stuff. So like, okay, you can't say anything, it's going to hurt the group of the minority. I think that the rise of women, I think that there's been sort of a feminization of institutions. A lot of this came through civil rights law too. I think there's been the activist women who've been behind a lot of this stuff are not representative of all women. They're disproportionately lesbian and childless and don't really have relationships with men. And those have been sort of the spokeswomen for all women in the United States over the last 60 years. So I think there's a gender issue and there's a race issue, and they're sort of they're related, but they're both they're interesting because they both have their own causes and their own influences on institutions.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, you go after the civil rights law. I mean, that's what you do. There's
which civil rights law?
So there's if you look at my article, woke institutions is just civil rights law. There's a lot. There's disparate impact. It's a standard that says if you give a test or something, discrimination doesn't mean you just don't want to hire Blacks or women. It's like you have a test or a standard where more people of one group do better than the other group. So that can be dealt with through like the Supreme Court. I mean, that's legal interpretation stuff. There's an executive order that basically requires affirmative action in government contractors. People don't know this. If you have a contract with the federal government, there's an executive order that says you classify all your employees according to race and sex, count them, make sure that you have enough in every position. And if you don't, set goals and timetables. This covers like a quarter.
What's enough? Is it based on the population percentage of the nation or the region you're in, or what?
They have regulations that explain you're supposed to, like, they don't even tell you, like, you're supposed to submit your own plan for every corporation does this, and then like you justify what you want to do. So it's a mess. It's a bureaucratic. They don't actually tell you to like exactly what to do, but they sort of just, all is you have to count race and sex. You have to have some goals on some basis, and then there's like harassment law, which you can get millions of dollars if you say the wrong word to somebody. And this stuff is against the First Amendment. Some of this stuff can be taken, some of this stuff can be rolled back just through having a more conservative Supreme Court. I think they're going to cut back on affirmative action. They're going to get rid of affirmative action in universities next year. It might not matter. The universities are going to do what they want, but I look forward to other areas of law where they can start to roll back this stuff. And then if you look at conservatives and libertarians, they can't be afraid of this stuff. The affirmative action issue has not been talked about by Republicans in the 30 years. I mean, they just stopped talking about it. I mean, they're scared of they can't have an honest discussion about sex differences. George Hawley has a book coming. Josh Hawley has a book coming out on manhood. I've seen his stuff. He tries to talk about these gender issues, but I had a critique on Twitter the other day. It never goes to the civil rights rights law, it never goes on to the idea that women are changing institutions. It's just very general and broad. Oh, men need to stand up and become, have masculine virtue, and there's no policy area that he actually, anywhere he takes it. So there's a role here for politicians, for activists, for intellectuals too.
I remember Senator Rand Paul, when he first came on the national stage, he came on through the controversy of some statement where he said he thought the 1964 Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional. Remember that?
Yeah, I
that back or pare it down or something in order to get through the primary. I remember that.
Yeah, and then he did, he sort of walked it back, and the Republicans, they stood by him, but they didn't defend the they didn't defend the statement. They are scared of this stuff, but you don't have to be. You don't have to really be scared of this stuff, because this stuff is very unpopular, actually. I mean, you look at like polls and stuff, just the media have convinced them that, this is dangerous. But I think Trump sort of leaned into these cultural issues, and, he did well electorally. So I think it's far from clear that this stuff is, going harder on this stuff actually hurts Republicans. And and you start the conversation anyway, even if it hurts you in the short term, like you change the terms of the conversation. You can't be afraid of the conversation for, decade after decade, and then things never get better. That's not the way to do things. Maybe you even take the hit, and then you hopefully move the Overton window a bit.
Yeah. What about the, you see it, the rise of HR departments? That's because of all these different intrusions into commerce, right?
Yeah. You go to the Woke Institutions, Just Civil Rights Law, the article I wrote. Yeah, the HR.
I think you wrote an article about HR as being such a big.
Yeah, and so there's a chart there. 1960s, it takes off. You look at the number of HR, it goes just like this. 1960s, after the Civil Rights Law, and they get that. I mean, a lot of corporations most of them didn't even have HR departments. They just
did you not describe it as like a wing of having the state as a wing? It's like a state wing of your company that you have to pay for.
Exactly. And so like the Obama administration, they would say like you have to have a Title IX coordinator, and they have to investigate. And that's how you got those kangaroo courts, sexual assault courts too. So the government will, they don't say you have to have an HR department, but it ends up because the law is so complicated, and you need to keep track of, which race and, which sex you're hiring and firing. And, you need legal experts. So you need this stuff in-house in order just to do business and to head off, potential lawsuits and regulators coming down on you. So yeah, it's a system where it's a very sneaky system, where it's not like the government just giving you the mandate, like that's clear and open, because that's easier to fight back against. When it's like, oh, don't discriminate, and then they change the definition of discriminate, and then they make it complicated, and then you have to hire HR, and then you really don't know, what you're going to do, and you have these, these HR enforcers within the organization. People don't know who to be mad at, or where to start, and that's a little bit what I try. That's why I try to focus people on civil rights law, which I think is the root of a lot of this stuff.
You said that one executive order. What was that, and who did that?
It was Lyndon Johnson. It was Executive Order 11246. And the executive order itself wasn't as bad. It was actually the Nixon administration which interpreted to require goals and timetables. Started with government contractors in it's called the Philadelphia Plan, and then extended to all government contractors.
Why didn't Donald Trump repeal that executive order?
I don't know. I wish he did. I mean, I think if he knew about it, he might have. There was Reagan was thinking about, Reagan was wanted to, apparently, in the 1980s, and Ed Meese, the Attorney General, was ready to do it. They were ready to get rid of this goals and timetable stuff, and then a lot of Republicans within the administration were against it. A lot of Republicans in Congress were against it. He ended up not doing it. So people used to think about this stuff. Now, I think the Republicans in Congress wouldn't be liberals on these issues. I think they would go along with the president. So there's an opportunity there. I mean, I think this is sort of low-hanging fruit.
So what would happen if we repealed that executive order? How would things change? Paint the picture for us. That's how you get people to, if you want to sell someone on something, you got to paint the picture of imagine a world where.
Yeah. I mean, probably immediately nothing, because no corporation is going to go, oh, we only hire these HR and we hired all these minorities because the government forced us right? So they're gonna, they're probably gonna say, they're probably gonna be against it. They're gonna say it's, it's bad to, and you're not gonna see that change overnight. What you will see, imagine, assuming this sticks, and you don't have to repeal. You could, I think what the Reagan was going to do was clarify to say it doesn't require goals and timetables. I like an idea of going further and say you can't have affirmative action. Like instead of repealing it, it's sort of better to sort of go on the offensive and say if you're going to have government contractors, you can't discriminate. But I think you would see, 5-10 years, you would see corporations, for example, when there's times of austerity, when the economy's hurting, suddenly these HR people, they're no longer necessary. Suddenly these lawyers are no longer necessary. New companies rise up. Silicon Valley, when it started, was famous for not having an HR department. In the end, they all got raked in the media, and so now they all, of course, are just like other corporations. But the next industry that rises through creative destruction will just have new norms and will not need the sort of the bureaucratic apparatus in order to navigate these government regulations. So it's
Is there a technological way to replace the HR department in a way that's healthy and creates cohesiveness in cultures inside companies?
Well, I mean, every corporation, every firm is going to have its own sort of way to do it. I mean, you could have an HR department that just basically cuts the paycheck and keeps track of hours and stuff like that. I think what you don't need is DEI, and that's unfortunately that's what we have.
Yeah. So when you see what about the argument from the left saying, well, because of redlining and systemic oppression and the segregation and all these different institutional unjust situations, and then you look at the criminal justice system and the drug war being more heavily affecting minority communities and all these different things, that you have to have some of these extra insertions to balance the scales a little bit, to give folks who've been predated institutionally a chance to get going.
Yeah, I mean, well, you've tried to do that for 3 generations. Now, the idea that redlining is the reason. I mean, there's a lot of immigrants that before the 1965 Civil Rights Act were redlined out of the entire country, and they came to the United States, and they've all done very well, and often usually done very well, and have low crime rates. So I don't buy this historical racism nonsense. There's groups that it's pretty normal for groups to be persecuted in very aggressive ways and then do very well socioeconomically. I don't think that connection is there. So it's there's you look at like these black these indicators for blacks, they often got worse. I mean, after the liberals started doing their policies. So in like after the 1960s, the black out of wedlock birth rate went up. The number of blacks in jail, the number of blacks committing crime went up in the 1960s when you started with the Great Society, when you started with civil rights law. So there's no reason to think it was helping. Some blacks did become did become wealthier and did move up, but that was happening before the 1960s too. So I don't.
I mean, if you're locked in like some of these inner cities that are run by these very aggressive social engineers, are very corrupt, right? And they've got occupational licensure. It's very difficult to start a business. They've got onerous taxes. They've got their jobs being shipped overseas. They've got this drug war that's pumping this very, very lucrative product that they can sell right down the road, and then that gets them locked up. So there's a lot of things that are incentivizing destruction of communities that are locked in those cities.
Sure. Say? Yeah, sure. I mean, sure, there's always, policies that, we can change. I'm with you. We can get rid of the occupational licensing. I don't think there's any good reason to have most of those.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't like to accept the frame that, oh, well, if we want to get rid of the affirmative action stuff, that means we're on the side of you haven't been given a raw deal in the past. I think we could still say, yes, you've been given a raw deal in the past, and in some cases still continuing, but there are liberty solutions that out-scratch that itch for justice better than the fake justice solutions from the other side. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Don't give them the turf of the empathetic framework. They don't have it. Yeah. You know what I mean? If someone's selling you a scam product, but they dress it with nice emotional language, I'm not going to position myself as the non-empathetic reaction to that. I'm going to say, actually, I'm way more empathetic. That's a fake. That's a fraud. Get off the stage. Here's the real solution.
Yeah,
That's kind of my framing, but maybe that's.
I'm fine with that. And and again, school choice is another good one. I mean, taking money away and resources away from the public schools. I don't think that will necessarily. I don't think it's like the quality of schools that matters here. I just think it's good to have people away from government schools.
Yeah.
They're horrible places.
I remember DeSantis when he ran, and won our governorship here in Florida. He, had 28% of black women voting for him, and school choice was a big topic that he was pushing in that campaign. So it shows that there's a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, it's a great issue. Yeah, I agree with you. These sort of liberty issues, as you call them. Yeah, they're often good, and they're often political winners too.
Right. So when you see, it's interesting, the HR thing. That's something that people don't talk about. You're right, and they don't talk about affirmative action, and it's almost considered like settled science.
Yeah, like a lot of things. Exactly. Yeah.
Is that because of experts? You're saying the cult of experts,
I mean,
or is it just something bigger than that?
Why don't people talk? I mean, people do talk about HR. They don't know the connection between HR and civil rights law. But I think people are just, they have low attention. Like, the quotas and affirmative action, that was a live issue for a really long time. People just forgot about it. I mean, the left got crazier and started like requiring DEI statements and saying like, being on time is white supremacy. And I think people just sort of forgot about like the original crazy stuff.
Right.
And they just, let it go, even though it's still very important.
That's one of the problems with having reactionaries run the conservative movement, is that they just react to whatever the shiny new toy is. So they never get to the systemic changes that need to happen.
I think that's right. I think there's a role here for people who have more of a historical perspective and who understand the sort of historical causation here. I think we need more of that.
Is it really a legal thing that will win this, or do you have to have a cultural change? Because if you've got people being catechized in government school and catechized in Hulu and Netflix, which are teaching them to stoke these racial divisions and animosities, how's that going to really be a fertile ground to repeal an executive order and a Supreme Court decision here or there? You know what I mean? You're going to really have to have a cultural change, aren't you? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I think that media is not, I don't think like Hulu and Netflix are as, left-wing as people think. I mean, recently the top, comedians on Netflix were like Ricky Gervais, Dave Chappelle. There was another
I don't think they're going to be joking about affirmative action.
Well, yeah, they're not joking about it, but they're joking about wokeness. They're joking about, transgenderism. So, this is the stuff people are getting from, this is the stuff, a lot of the media, a lot of the successful stuff, because it taps into human nature. It's consistent with things people want. So it's a cultural thing, and it's a legal thing. I mean, but they influence each other so much. I mean, if you're in public schools and you're in public school 7 hours a day, how is that not going to influence you culturally, right? I mean, that's just obviously it's going to have an effect. So these things are related. People should do, artists have a role, and intellectuals and government officials have a role too. I mean, I think everyone should be pushing in the same direction here.
Yeah, if you go to government school and then you have a smartphone and video games and TV, you are really spending more time with the collective than you are with your parents, pretty much. You know what I mean? In terms of your attention, right? If you're going to school from that long every day for your childhood, and then you've got a smartphone or an iPad or TV or video games for the few hours you've got at home with mom and dad, you're only going to see mom and dad in between that, and then maybe on the weekends there when they do something with you. But that's not a lot of time to have cultural transmission outside of the the power sources of status society. Or
I mean, it's always been, people have always kids have always gone off and gone to school, and it depends on the larger culture. So parents can only be around their kids so much, they can only do so much. Kids want to be like their friends, and they want to be like what's in the culture more than they do their parents. So yeah, I think we have to sort of have a we have to understand that these things matter a lot, and you worry about the next generation. You can't just sort of outsource it to the government and the educational establishment that's been doing such a terrible job for so long.
I noticed in one of your recent podcasts on your Substack, you had Mark Andreessen on, and you were talking about Better Call Saul, this TV series. Do I bring up the culture stuff because I'm thinking, do you see, why do you engage these culture pieces? Is just for fun, or do you see this as part of the broader project of what you're trying to do with your group?
Oh, just fun. I mean,
It's all
it's really
fun.
yeah, it's all fun. There's great art. There's great art out there, but I just really like talking about sort of TV and movies and doing cultural analysis. I think of it, it probably, it certainly doesn't hurt. It's probably good to have sort of a right-leaning cultural analysis out there, but it's not like it's well thought out to be, part of a mission. It's just sort of, I enjoy doing it.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually the most important thing we can do is to have good art, because if you don't have good art, you don't really, like, if you can't win. The left has had a monopoly on focusing on funding the arts in all of its different forms, whether it's high art or pop art and all the different cinema and all these different things. They've been catechizing people for generations, and if you don't focus as your priority that, and all you do is make political donations your main source of capital attention, you're always going to be in a rear guard action, in my opinion. I really do believe
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and I think I think the political stuff is probably more important than most people. I mean, if you're going to make but if you're going to make political donations and stuff, make sure you're focusing on the right issues and it actually matters. And we haven't had that, and that's, try to get people on the right track here is sort of, what I'm trying to do.
So what do you see as the most positive thing that's coming out in our society right now? Is it the school choice revolution? Is it this waking up about the problem of big tech? Is it people challenging public health experts for the first time and
Yeah,
forever?
all of the above. I mean, I think it's all part of the same thing. I think people, really, really dislike, they see the experts are full of it. And there's a polarization too. There's some part of the public that like worships experts now more than ever, and trusts the science and all that stuff, and are woker than ever. So that's there. But there's also, a good maybe, half the country or maybe less, but a quarter of the country, whatever, that is really, has fed up and it's gonna always oppose these people. So that manifests itself in the school choice stuff. There was a great law just recently passed in Arizona that basically is a universal school choice program. You see a lot of the bans on critical race theory, and I think people are listening to my stuff on civil rights law. So I think we'll get something there. I think that when the liberals come into power, I mean, I think they've got so crazy and on the government spending that they're going to hurt themselves, because economically you're going to get inflation and you're going to get like a recession that we have now, and so that'll give conservatives a chance to come back into power, and we'll see what they do with it.
Well, very good. So anything coming down the pipeline from you, projects or books or things on your program that you'd like people to know about?
No, not really. I do have some things in the pipeline, but I'm not really talking about them yet. So for the time being, subscribe to the CSPI newsletter, subscribe to my Substack, and follow me on Twitter.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Very good. Take care.